Okay, so today I'm going to talk through the questions on the first PowerPoint on energy transfers and nutrient cycles, talk through sort of my understanding of the answers, and just trying to make sure, I guess, you are on the same page and you had the same sort of answers to me. So follow along, see what you've written, and yeah, we'll see how we go. So the first question shows us a food web for an oak woodland community. So remember, a food web shows the transfer of energy within a community or an ecosystem. So which direction the energy is transferring from and to. So for this particular food web, we see down here, we start off sort of, we have the oak tree and we have organic material, which would be our primary producers. And then there are different organisms that feed off of these plants and use that as their food source directly. So the caterpillar and the squirrel feed off the oak trees, so they would be primary consumers. The earthworm and the wood mouse feed off the organic material or the leaf litter, so they would also be primary consumers. And you can see that the energy is transferring from the oak tree to the caterpillar, and that's why the direction of that arrow is towards the caterpillar. And then we can see, other organisms feed off of those primary consumers and gain energy from them. So the shrew would eat the caterpillars, and the owls would eat the shrew. Now the owl also eats the wood mouse, and the wood mouse also gains energy from the earthworm. So this is an interconnected food web. It's not just a linear, straight line sort of food web. So let's have a look at some of the questions. So the first question is to identify 3 primary consumers. So remember, the primary consumers are those organisms that feed on the primary producers. So in this case, the primary producers are our plant and shrub life. So it would be the oak tree and the organic material would be our primary producers. So the primary consumers, so primary meaning first consumers, so they're the ones that consume the primary producers, would be our caterpillars and our squirrel, which feed on the oak tree, and the earthworm and the wood mouse, which feed on the leaf litter. So any of those 4 would be considered a primary consumer. State why the owl is described as a tertiary consumer. So tertiary means third, so that would be the third consumer after the primary producers in any energy transfer sequence. Okay, so if we think about third in line, there are a couple of tertiary consumers here. We know the caterpillar, the earthworm, and the wood mouse and the squirrel are primary, so they're the first consumers. The wood mouse is also a secondary consumer because it consumes the earthworm. So the fox in this particular sequence would actually be a tertiary consumer. So earthworm would be primary, wood mouse would be secondary, fox could be a tertiary. Now, if we look at the owl, similarly, if we take the oak tree as our primary producer, the caterpillar in this particular sequence is the primary consumer. It's the first consumer that is feeding on the producer. The shrew would be our secondary consumer, and therefore the owl would be our tertiary consumer because it feeds on a secondary consumer, in this case, the shrew. It's also a tertiary consumer in in one other sequence. So the earthworm would be a primary consumer, the wood mouse is a secondary consumer, and the owl would be a tertiary consumer in that sequence also. So it's actually a tertiary consumer in 2 different sequences. All right, so the diagram below shows an energy pyramid in the oak woodland. So we know here, we can see the energy available is showing the amount of energy available, all right, at each different trophic level. So we have our first trophic level here, which has the majority of energy available. Okay, so this would represent our primary producer, so our plant life and how much energy is available to at the plant level. This would be our primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer. And you'll notice that at each level, we're losing about 90% of the amount of energy available, and that's represented by the width or the area of the level as you go up. So explain the shape of the energy period. Well, I sort of just did. As we go up the energy pyramid, we are losing energy, and therefore each of the shapes at each level represents the amount of energy available. And you can see what we're losing about 90% of a very large portion of the energy as we go up the energy pyramid there. What are two reasons for the decrease in energy available to the primary consumers? And so the way I sort of take that question is that we have sort of the sun as the overall sort of initial source of energy. That energy is then taken by the primary producers, our plant life, and then the primary consumers feed on the plant. So I think what they're asking here is, why is all the energy from the sun not available to the primary consumers? What happens between the sun and the primary producers that we lose so much energy? Why can't the primary consumers eat the plants and get all the energy that was available from the sun? Well, there's a few different reasons why the primary producers do not convert all of the energy from the sun. One, not all wavelengths of light can be absorbed by leaves. So about 90% or 90 to 95% of light is actually reflected off the leaves and then not actually absorbed and used. Also, the chlorophyll isn't a perfect system. It's not going to convert all of the light energy available, so we lose some purely through inefficiencies in the chlorophyll converting light energy into organic energy. And also, the plant uses energy through the conversion of light into organic energy. Actually uses up energy, and also uses energy through respiration as well. So there's some energy lost by the plants in maintaining, through heat, through photosynthesis, and also through respiration. So yeah, it loses quite a lot of energy, and only like 3 to 5% of the energy available from the sun is actually converted into organic energy, which is available for the primary consumers. What are two reasons for the decrease in energy available to tertiary consumers? So here now, the primary consumers have eaten the plants, secondary consumers have come along. So why are we losing so much energy from the primary consumers up until the tertiary consumers? Similar sort of idea. The first is that not all of the animal that is eaten at each stage is digested, so we lose a lot of, there's a lot of waste products in digestion, whether it's we don't eat the bones, or we don't eat certain parts of the animals, and they just go to waste, so therefore that energy isn't then transferred on. We also lose a lot, our no digestive system is perfect, so there's a lot of inefficiency in the digestion, so sometimes we just don't digest all of the organic material available in order to convert it into, and use the energy to be transferred on. We also, all animals also need to undergo a lot of those processes, like respiration, maintaining body temperature. If it's a warm-blooded animal, there's a lot of energy lost just maintaining bodily processes. And so all of the energy that was available at the primary consumer level is not transferred down to the tertiary consumers because it's lost in different forms. So predict the effect of deforestation or the removal of trees on the food web of the oak woodlands. So if we come up here to our food web, what they're saying is that, okay, what would happen if we got rid of the oak trees? Well, it would have a big effect, because you can see almost everything in this food web relies on the oak tree. Even the leaf litter comes from the oak tree, and the oak tree dropping leaves onto the ground. And so if we didn't have the oak trees, we wouldn't have the leaf litter either. It means we pretty much have no primary producers. And if a food web doesn't have a primary producer, the whole thing breaks down. So all of our primary consumers have no food source, which means our secondary consumers have no food source. Our owls then have no food source. Foxes have no food source. So all of the animals in this particular food web would lose that source of food. Now, that's not to say that they don't have any other source of food. They probably do. But just looking at this particular food web, it would have a big flow-on effect. So none of these animals would be able to gain energy from our primary producers here because we would lose both of these. And that's really it. There wasn't a huge amount of questions on this particular PowerPoint. So I'm gonna, so I'm just gonna leave it there for a second. Actually, no, we'll have a look at the food web. So we also had our second worksheet that I asked you to have a bit of a look at, which was looking at a food web, which you sort of had to create. You were given a bunch of information, you created a food web, and you looked at where each of those things sat. So let's have a read through. So we're told the Torrens River in the Adelaide Hills starts as several small creeks which joins to form one larger creek. As it winds down the hills to the city, more and more water is added. It only flows in winter when the rainfall is sufficient, dries up into small waterholes during the summer. So a weir is used to hold water permanently in the city, and it's surprising how many organisms rely on this particular river for their existence. So algae can be observed growing in the water, so that would be a primary producer, as well as water ribbons. And on the water edge, fluffy-topped reeds such as the common reed and the bulrush grow. So water boatmen, which are like little bugs, are observed swimming in the water. They're eating the algae in the reeds. The mosquito larvae also eat the algae, while the freshwater snail eats both the algae and water ribbons. A long-necked tortoise pokes its nostrils above the water, which eats the algae too, as well as feeding on snails, boatmen, and yabbies. The water boatmen provide food for many species like fish, frogs, diving beetles, dragonfly larvae. The yabbies are scavengers, feeding on rotten plant and animal matter, while bacteria also break down dead material by digesting it and recycling nutrients. So the mosquito larvae are considered a delicacy for frogs and several varieties of fish, such as the big-headed gudgeon or the gongoli. We're told birds are in abundance along the waterway. So for Pacific black ducks are feeding on fish, dragonfly larvae, and diving beetles, while the occasional pelican feeds on fish, frogs, and dragonfly larvae. Black swans make a beautiful sight, bending their elegant necks to forage under the water, grazing on the water ribbon, snails, and occasional fish. And the white-faced heron makes a meal on the fish and frogs. Purple swamp hen runs quickly from the bulrushes, where it feeds on the growth of the bulrushes and makes its nest. And on the bank of blue-tongued lizards, sunning itself, snapping at the dragonflies and diving beetle. Beware the unwary frog, the lizard will sometimes eat them too. So a whole range of different information. Okay, first is to divide the organisms. So we know those primary producers were our reeds, we had bulrushes, algae, and water ribbons. We had a range of different organisms that fed on the producers. So they were the water boatmen, the long-necked tortoise, mosquito larvae, yabby, freshwater snail, swan, swamp hen, and diving beetle. And then we had sort of our second order consumers and higher, where our blue-tongued lizards, the fish, the congoli, and the big-headed gudgeon, the common froglet, dragonfly larvae, Pacific black duck, white-faced heron, and pelican. So we first had to divide the organisms into categories. And then there's some questions. So which of the organisms contain chlorophyll? Are they producers or consumers? How do you know? Well, only the producers will contain the chlorophyll because that's where the light energy is converted into organic energy. So the algae, reeds, and water ribbons are all producers and use chlorophyll for photosynthesis. So they convert the light into energy, producing their own food. Which organisms feed on the algae? Well, the tortoise, the water boatman, the mosquito larvae, and the snail. Which organisms feed on the fish? The ducks, heron, and pelican. Find a food chain from your web with at least 4 organisms, placing them in a pyramid with producer at the bottom, highest order consumer at the top. Estimating numbers based on sort of what we would expect to see. So the algae could be at the very bottom. That would be our primary producer. A primary consumer could be the mosquito larvae in this particular, food chain. And say there's like 3 million algae, we might have about 100,000 larvae. As we go up, we'd have less and less organisms. So the frogs, it might only be sort of 35 frogs, maybe only a couple of pelicans. Because remember, each time we go up our pyramid, we're losing energy available, so there has to be less and less organisms. But the organisms tend to get larger, but there's just less of them. So what organisms are decomposers? Where do they live? Well, they're the bacteria and fungi, and they live in the soil and the plant and animal matter in the creek or the riverbed. And they're able to process sort of larger organisms, the ones that die off. They break them down into simple components, which they use as food, and they expel the simpler components as waste products that are returned to the food chain. Okay, so what would happen if an oil spill occurred? Well, the oil would form a layer on top of the water, which would block the oxygen from getting into the water. So therefore, all the invertebrates would be unable to obtain oxygen. And if they actually entered that oil layer, they would cover their gills and prevent them from functioning. So a lot of animals and plants would actually die off or suffer some form of long-term effect. What if all the fish were killed? Well, if the fish are killed, then the water birds, which rely on the fish, would then, realize, wait, we don't have a food source here, so we're going to move on. We're going to go to another area to find food. That would increase competition in this other area, which would be issues there, or they would just sort of hang around and face starvation potentially. So if several house owners nearby fertilize their lawns, if they fertilize their lawns and then that's followed by a big rain, that rain will wash the fertilizer into the river. And lawn fertilizer usually contains large amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus, and also some potassium and sulfur and other elements. And this actually causes algae to grow a lot within the river. So if we get the fertilizer goes into the river, the algae becomes a lot more abundant, and this can cause what we call algal bloom. They can occur naturally, but generally when there's increased nutrient flow, this occurs, and it can reduce the amount of oxygen in the water. Because again, similar to the oil, it blocks off a lot of the oxygen that's available to the water and uses up a lot of the oxygen within the water. And so this can kill or stress the fish and other organisms and can produce toxic byproducts, which makes the water unsuitable for drinking and use, which can have an effect for us as well. Now, if the weather is warmer and we get less rainfall, well, obviously then there's going to be less water available. The problem is as you evaporate or lose water, you're still having the same amount of salt. So the concentration of salt and other nutrients in the water will increase. Those higher temperatures will also make it more suitable for breeding and cause rapid increase in organisms like algae and invertebrates. And the warmer water will also affect how much oxygen is dissolved in the water, so it'll have a large effect. And then there's just ask you to create a food web. Here's, I guess, my take on the food web. So again, we have our primary producers at the bottom, the bulrushes and the reeds and the algae and the water ribbons. And then off of that, we can see the direction of transfer of energy from one organism to another. You can have a look through that.